Ghislaine Maxwell has launched a bold, calculated campaign to rewrite history. In a prison interview that is at once audacious, chilling, and strangely compelling, she is making claims that stretch the imagination, unsettle the elite, and threaten to reframe events that many had long assumed were settled. History is littered with decades of silence, yet it only takes a single, unexpected voice to shatter it completely. Behind the walls of her cell, a name once thought buried forever has surged back into the global spotlight. Ghislaine Maxwell is speaking, and the ripple effects are already shaking royal watchers, journalists, and historians alike. What was once dismissed as rumor or conspiracy is now being reconsidered with a renewed, uneasy urgency, as the world watches, riveted and unsettled. Everywhere, conversations hum with renewed intensity. Whispers float about private letters, off-the-record exchanges, and connections long thought dormant, threads of influence that have reappeared after years of silence. Heated debates reignite, exposing fissures between those who believe Maxwell's revelations could illuminate hidden truths and those who insist it is sensationalized theater. Supporters and skeptics alike brace themselves, anticipating what revelations may come next, while unnamed sources quietly hint at consequences too explosive for any palace press office to contain. Is this a deliberate tactic, a search for leverage, or merely another shockwave in the relentless tabloid storm that has trailed Maxwell for decades? And why does this moment feel uniquely perilous for Meghan Markle, whose name, according to these accounts, may have surfaced in the most unlikeliest of contexts, intertwining her life with shadows she never sought? Maxwell's purported revelations read like a suspense-heavy thriller, layered with intrigue and shrouded in ambiguity. The claims are dramatic, deeply speculative, and entangled once again in the long, dark shadow of Jeffrey Epstein's criminal empire. According to insiders, the truth was never lost. It was deliberately hidden in plain sight, locked behind sealed files, heavily redacted documents, and years of carefully orchestrated silence. Behind the closed doors of courtrooms and restricted archives, sources allege that audio recordings vanished, and documents were only released after exhaustive censorship. Even when Epstein-related materials surfaced publicly, critics argue they were heavily edited, stripped of their most revealing portions, leaving gaping holes that fueled suspicion and magnified intrigue. Every redacted transcript, every missing audio clip, became another spark for speculation, prompting renewed curiosity about what truths might have been deliberately concealed. Among the most discussed elements are claims that Maxwell sat for up to 12 hours of interviews, hours that insiders allege contained sensitive, high-stakes discussions never intended for public ears. Within these hours lies the detail that has captured the most attention. Meghan Markle's name was allegedly mentioned. Far from portraying her journey into royal life as a straightforward story of ambition, talent, and romance, this account paints a far more intricate, layered, and enigmatic picture. According to those familiar with the interviews, Maxwell allegedly described elite social environments where wealth, power, and influence flowed with little constraint, where introductions were never accidental, and where every movement, every conversation, carried a carefully measured purpose. In this retelling, Meghan's name reportedly emerged as part of discussions about these rarefied circles, hinting that her presence, her actions, and her path were quietly observed and noted by figures operating far from public scrutiny. The narrative goes even further, suggesting that Maxwell sometimes used coded language when referencing individuals, deliberately softening implications or shielding identities. Meghan, according to these accounts, was referred to by the nickname Flower, a term that conveyed grace, beauty, and the appearance of innocence, a symbolic label that marked her as someone notable, someone whose presence in elite spaces carried a significance that few outsiders could perceive. Supporters of this theory argue that the nickname aligns with patterns Maxwell allegedly employed when describing women who navigated high society gatherings with poise and ease, subtly distinguishing those she deemed important or protected. Yet, the story emphasizes repeatedly that no direct, publicly available evidence confirms any of this. The intrigue does not emerge from proof, but from absence, gaps in timelines, unexplained omissions in records, and the secrets suggested but never confirmed. It is the space between what is known and what is hidden that fuels fascination, leaving observers to wonder what lies behind carefully closed doors. The implications, if even partially true, are staggering. They suggest a world in which influence, introductions, and social navigation were as crucial as talent or ambition. Meghan's rise in this account was not purely the result of chance encounters or serendipitous romance. Instead, she was moving through a landscape shaped by invisible hands, a carefully managed network of relationships and opportunities that only the few could see, let alone control. Every whispered conversation, every social introduction, every private gathering could have carried meaning far beyond the apparent moment. The suggestion is that these early experiences, meetings, introductions, and social positioning, may have laid the groundwork for her eventual ascent into global prominence, preparing her for a life that would place her at the very center of international attention, scrutiny, and influence. This account, however, is more than a tale of social maneuvering. It is also a story about power, secrecy, and the invisible forces that shape the trajectories of those who walk among the elite. It highlights a world in which influence flows quietly, decisions are made behind the scenes, and reputations can be built or destroyed without the public ever understanding why. And at the heart of this story is the tension between what is visible and what is hidden, between perception and reality, between the lives that the public sees and the networks that quietly steer them. For Meghan Markle, according to these accounts, the nickname Flower may be emblematic not just of grace, but of the precarious balance she had to maintain while navigating a world in which every interaction, every introduction, and every whisper could carry extraordinary consequences. Ultimately, the intrigue surrounding Maxwell's revelations does not rest on what can be proven, but on what is suggested. The story is compelling precisely because it sits at the intersection of rumor and possibility, of secrecy and revelation, of silence and sudden disclosure. It raises profound questions. How much of Meghan's ascent was shaped by unseen social currents? How carefully curated were the environments she moved through? And how much power, influence, and protection might have quietly supported her along the way? These questions remain unanswered and perhaps, for now, unanswerable. But the mere possibility of hidden connections, whispered codes, and invisible hands guiding events is enough to capture the imagination, spark debate, and ensure that Maxwell's words, however controversial, will continue to resonate, ripple, and provoke discussion long into the future. To fully understand Ferguson's role in this alleged web, the narrative takes us back to the turn of the millennium, long before the world knew Meghan Markle's name or imagined the public spectacle of a royal wedding. At that time, Sarah Ferguson, Fergie, as she is widely known, still wielded influence within elite social circles despite her divorce from Prince Andrew. She is portrayed in these accounts as a quiet gatekeeper, a woman who understood the invisible architecture of British high society better than almost anyone. Invitations, introductions, and exclusions were said to pass through her hands like delicate threads on a loom, weaving connections, alliances, and boundaries in spaces few outside the inner circle could ever penetrate. Ferguson allegedly monitored every move, quietly ensuring that only the appropriate individuals were allowed into the highest echelons, while others were steered away before they could even be noticed. It is in this context that Meghan Markle, according to the narrative, is said to have appeared on the periphery of royal and high society life. She was not yet a public figure, not yet the actress whose name would later headline tabloids, and certainly not yet the woman destined for global attention. Yet insiders suggest she was quietly present in these elite networks, moving along the edges, observed by those who managed access to power. Fergie, in this account, allegedly recognized potential risks early. She is said to have acted as a shield, not aggressively but with subtle social maneuvering. Conversations were redirected, introductions carefully managed, and potential connections between Meghan and more controversial figures, such as Prince Andrew or those linked to Epstein, were allegedly deflected. According to some sources, Ferguson's efforts were a form of social body blocking, a preventive measure designed to ensure that Meghan could navigate elite spaces safely without inadvertently triggering scandal. Despite these precautions, Meghan's trajectory could not be completely contained. She continued to move through London's elite spaces, private members' clubs, invitation-only events, high-profile charity galas, and other gatherings where wealth, influence, and ambition mixed like a charged current. She remained close enough to the corridors of power to feel their pull, yet far enough to avoid direct scrutiny. Observers note that she seemed adept at negotiating these spaces, her presence both natural and deliberate, as though she understood the unspoken rules that governed elite social mobility. The narrative suggests that by the time she formally entered the royal orbit, her foundation had already been laid, a combination of social awareness, careful positioning, and an uncanny ability to navigate a world of both opportunity and danger. The story then fast-forwards to pivotal moments in her rise. In April 2015, Prince Harry attended the grand opening of a Soho house in Istanbul, an event dripping with wealth, influence, and subtle cues of royalty. Among the carefully curated guests was Meghan Markle, whose presence insiders now describe as pivotal to her trajectory. These gatherings were not casual social events. They were meticulously engineered ecosystems designed to maximize networking, exposure, and opportunity. Seating, introductions, timing, and guest lists were all calculated. CEOs, celebrities, political figures, and even royalty mingled strategically, ensuring that every interaction had the potential to reshape futures. Observers argue that Meghan's encounter with Harry was no coincidence. It was an orchestrated moment, the true launch of her global prominence. From that evening onward, her visibility, influence, and access to power accelerated, with invitations multiplying and her presence in elite social and humanitarian spaces becoming increasingly prominent. The narrative deepens further, tracing her movements to New York in 2013, when she allegedly began moving through private salons reserved for media executives, political operatives, philanthropists, and influential donors. These weren't casual gatherings. They were arenas of influence where conversations could determine careers, alliances, and opportunities. Attendees like Harvey Weinstein still dominated these spaces, and those present were not merely passing through. They were building networks that would shape the future of entertainment, politics, and philanthropy. By 2014, Meghan appeared at Public Q and has connected to Clinton-aligned organizations in Ukraine, long before Suits had brought her global recognition. Early access to these circles, in hindsight, suggested ambition, curiosity, or both, but also a keen ability to navigate spaces few outsiders could enter. This trajectory, viewed alongside Maxwell's alleged resurfacing, casts a new light on the intersections of wealth, power, and influence. Epstein's money is said to have flowed into humanitarian initiatives connected to global figures, including the Clintons, and though these claims remain unverified, the possibility alone stirs speculation. Could introductions, access, and influence have traveled alongside these funds? Viewed through this lens, Meghan's rapid entry into elite humanitarian and political spheres after Istanbul appears less like luck and more like a carefully guided progression, a path that positioned her to eventually meet Prince Harry and enter the royal orbit with precision timing. Central to this narrative are the mysterious 12 hours allegedly recorded with Maxwell, hours said to contain names, dates, and connections that could map Meghan's rise from relative obscurity to global prominence. These details, if they exist, are not presented as proof of wrongdoing, but as pieces of a system designed to elevate and protect certain individuals until the world was ready, or until secrets became too dangerous to remain hidden. The story hangs in suspension, like the opening chapter of a thriller, leaving readers breathless, guessing, and aware that the true beginning of this narrative remains concealed, waiting to be uncovered layer by layer. The story now shifts from public events to private corridors of power, where influence is wielded silently, and consequences are measured in subtle gestures rather than headlines. Maxwell's alleged 12 hours of interviews are said to contain the threads linking past and present, a chronicle of introductions, strategic placements, and unspoken knowledge. These hours, if they exist as described, suggest that Meghan's trajectory was observed and recorded long before the global spotlight ever fell on her. Every party, charity gala, and private gathering becomes a potential waypoint in a network of carefully monitored interactions. From Soho House in Istanbul to New York salons and London's invitation-only events, the story frames Meghan's rise not as happenstance, but as navigation through a landscape where every move is watched, cataloged, and evaluated. Epstein's influence, Maxwell's role, and the reach of royal associates like Sarah Ferguson converge in this narrative to create a system where power is both visible and invisible. Ferguson's alleged social body blocking, guiding Meghan safely around potential hazards, contrasts with Maxwell's alleged orchestration of introductions and surveillance of elite networks. Both women, operating in very different spheres, seem to embody forms of control over access, information, and opportunity. In this telling, Meghan's careful positioning, charisma, and public poise are complemented by unseen guidance, an interplay of agency and orchestration that keeps her trajectory moving forward while avoiding potential scandal. The tale extends beyond immediate social maneuvering into the structural power of networks themselves. Royalty, celebrities, financiers, and political actors are depicted as part of an ecosystem in which introductions are calculated, access is guarded, and reputations are meticulously managed. The yacht, the Soho House openings, the New York salons, all become nodes in a lattice of influence where a single evening can reshape futures. Observers suggest that a combination of luck, timing, and strategic exposure enabled Meghan to rise, but Maxwell's alleged recollections hint at something far more deliberate. A series of interactions and interventions designed to position her for visibility and influence without entangling her in scandal. Even within the royal family, caution is depicted as a central theme. William, portrayed as guardian of the monarchy's future, allegedly acted to prevent even indirect exposure to connections that might stir controversy. Prince Andrew's public sidelining in certain events is framed not as personal rivalry, but as strategic shielding, ensuring that questions tied to Epstein-Maxwell networks never intersected too closely with the heirs to the throne. Behind palace walls, influence, power, and secrecy intertwined to form invisible boundaries, lines that Meghan had to navigate with intuition, discretion, and perhaps unrecognized protection from those who understood the risks. Maxwell's resurgence, occurring decades after her initial rise alongside Epstein, casts a long shadow over these events. Her willingness to speak, her audacity to revisit moments that were once hidden, forces a reassessment of past assumptions. The 2001 Palm Beach investigation, once viewed as a closed case, gains new significance. Early warning signs, administrative recruitment, and alleged improper conduct now appear as the opening act of a sprawling, decades-long narrative of influence, proximity, and carefully orchestrated access. The intervening years, punctuated by scandals, settlements, and hidden recordings, reinforce the notion that what the public sees is rarely the full story. At the center of this unfolding narrative is Meghan herself, portrayed not as a passive observer, but as a figure whose silence, strategic choices, and composure confer subtle power. Her integration into royal life is no longer simply a story of romance and celebrity. It is framed as the culmination of careful navigation through a labyrinth of elite networks, past associations, and shadowed opportunities. Supporters, critics, and historians alike are left to ponder how much of her ascent was guided by chance, how much by unseen mentorship, and how much by the careful orchestration of figures like Ferguson or, allegedly, Maxwell herself. The story remains unresolved, tension perpetually maintained. Every yacht gathering, private gala, and whispered introduction gains renewed meaning. The questions Maxwell raises, even if unverified, challenge public narratives and invite speculation. Which connections were protective, which were opportunistic, and which were dangerous? How much knowledge does Meghan carry about circles the public only glimpses? And perhaps most importantly, who truly orchestrates the intersection of power, influence, and exposure in a world where secrets often determine the trajectory of lives? In the end, the tale hangs like a carefully constructed thriller, a narrative of strategic moves, invisible guidance, and high-stakes social navigation. Maxwell's voice, emerging from prison walls decades after events transpired, acts as both a catalyst and a lens, prompting a reevaluation of history, power, and agency. The public may never know all the answers, but the questions themselves illuminate the intricate and often unseen choreography that shapes elite life, and the delicate, sometimes perilous path that brought Meghan Markle from obscurity into the glare of global attention.